If anyone believes that church people are somehow morally superior to all other people, this gospel lesson will set you straight real quick. This lesson easily refutes the notion that church people somehow have an inside track as to Jesus' teachings of love and grace and service. This gospel lesson teaches us that sometimes we all get it wrong. Even those, or maybe even especially those, who have followed Jesus most closely. To this point in Mark, Jesus has predicted several times his suffering and death. He has told his disciples that what awaits him is not a triumphant victory, but betrayal, false accusations, beatings, and death. They seem to not have heard a word of it, because in today's passage, James and John have been following Jesus very closely. They have heard his teachings, they have witnessed his miracles, they have received his ministry of service. But to read this section of Mark, one would draw the conclusion that none of this seems to have stuck. Because they ask him, "Teacher, we want you to do whatever we ask of you." So Jesus replies, "What is it that you want?" Now let me pause here and say that when Jesus asks this, the text doesn't say, but I almost get the impression he is like a parent when a child makes a demand. It's almost as if Jesus says, "Oh, this should be good. This will be rich. Tell me, what is it that you want?" They reply with no discernible hint of sarcasm, "In your glory, we want to sit next to you. One of us on your right hand, one of us on your left." Jesus replies, "You don't even know what you're asking for. At my kingdom's banquet, the most important people don't sit at the head table. They're not rubbing elbows with diplomats or bigwigs. No, the most important people are the servants, those who move in and out of the crowd, refilling glasses, washing dishes, mopping the floors afterward." James and John are in it for reward. But Jesus says that's not how this works. Barbara Brown Taylor puts it this way: Jesus is not in it for reward. He's in it for the love of God, who promises him nothing but the opportunity to give himself away. She says the best seat he will get this side of the grave is a throne full of splinters. And when he is hung out to dry by the powers that be, it will not be James and John on either side, but two unnamed bandits, one on his left and one on his right. Following Jesus is not about privilege and reward. It's about serving one another. One of the ways we do this in church is by serving as priests to one another. The priesthood of every believer, we call it. What does this mean? Here's how Carlisle Marney puts it. We are priests to one another. I don't priest myself, I priest you, and vice versa. On this, the community of witness takes its rise. He says, without it, no church exists at all. All this means, of course, that I am not CEO of River Road Church. No, within this community, I am called to model a life of service and priesthood and call you to do the same. James and John come to Jesus vying for positions of prestige. But Jesus says, my people live by a different rule. He says, whoever wishes to become great among you must be your servant. And whoever wishes to be first among you must be slave of all. Growing up, I loved Fred Rogers. Though he's been deceased for a number of years, I still love Fred Rogers. He was the kind gentleman, of course, who through the magic of television welcomed children to be part of Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. Fred was a Presbyterian pastor from Pittsburgh, I believe, whose congregation included me and countless other children across the nation. In 1998, Esquire magazine ran a rather lengthy article, wonderful article, on Mr. Rogers. In it, the author told a story about how, for many years, Mr. Rogers would go and visit a boy in California who had cerebral palsy. The boy was rendered self-abusive and depressed by his disease, but he adored Mr. Rogers. So he was very excited about each of these visits. But when Fred arrived, the boy lapsed into a fit of self-loathing so terrible that he had to leave the room for a while. But Fred just waited. He waited until the boy was able to return, and then surprised the boy by saying, I would like you to do something for me. Would you do something for me? The boy answered, yes, of course. He would do anything for Mr. Rogers. So Rogers said, I would like you to pray for me. Will you pray for me? I'm quoting the article here. The boy was thunderstruck. Thunderstruck means you can't talk because something has happened that's as sudden and miraculous and maybe as scary as a bolt of lightning, and all you can do is listen to the rumble. The boy was thunderstruck because nobody had ever asked him for something like that, ever. The boy had always been prayed for. The boy had always been the object of prayer, and now he was being asked to pray for Mr. Rogers. And although at first he didn't know if he could do it, he said he would. He said he would try. And ever since then, he keeps Mr. Rogers in his daily prayers. He doesn't talk about wanting to die anymore because he figures Mr. Rogers is close to God. And if Mr. Rogers likes him, then that must mean God likes him too. As the journalist was interviewing Mr. Rogers for the article, he congratulated Fred on this psychological insight. But Fred looked surprised and said, "Oh, heavens, no. I didn't ask him for his prayers for him. I asked for me. I asked him because I think that anyone who has gone through challenges like that must be very close to God. I asked him because I need his prayers." Mr. Rogers lived what Jesus taught. That we become great not by asserting our dominance, but by stooping low to serve one another and allowing them to serve us. And I'll be the first to admit, this makes no sense at all. This goes against everything that we've learned in this world. Our politicians have taught us that the way to win an election is to be as nasty as possible to one's opponent. Our business leaders have taught us that we must take out anyone who stands in our way because, hey, it's not personal, it's just business. Even some of our faith leaders, I'm afraid to say, have taught us that ministry is about power and ego, not the simple way of Christ. Whoever wants to be great must become a servant? Makes no sense. Reminds me of a story about Clarence Jordan and Koinonia Farms. Are you familiar with Jordan and Koinonia? Jordan was a Baptist minister and founder of Koinonia, which turned out to be, by the way, the spiritual ancestor of Habitat for Humanity. Koinonia Farms was the first interracial community in the South in the early 1950s. And from its inception, the farm met violent and bitter opposition from the townspeople in nearby Americus, Georgia. Arson, beatings, and death threats were among their favorite ways to respond to Jordan and his enterprise. Soon everyone had been driven from the farm except Jordan and his family. Several buildings were in ashes, and his children slept on the floor to avoid bullets sprayed from passing cars. One day, grinning from ear to ear, a deacon from the local Baptist church asked him, "Well, Clarence, just how successful do you think this whole thing of yours has been?" Jordan thought for a minute and then responded quietly, "Oh, I guess it's been about as successful as the cross." Makes no sense. Whoever wants to be great, Jesus says, must become a servant. It makes no sense. It may make no sense to this world, but we know it's the only way. You know, the life of faith often seems like a journey to me. Our baptisms do not represent any sort of finish line, but instead indicate that we desire to begin a journey with Christ. Throughout our lives until we draw our last breath, our call is to grow into the person that God calls us to be, not necessarily the person we want to be. Most, if not all of us, strive for greatness, to be at the top of the heap, the first of the class, better than the rest. Martin Luther King Jr., in his sermon on this passage, calls this our drum major instinct. We want to be first in line. But Jesus calls us to a different kind of greatness. And it's a lesson we learn over the whole trajectory of our journey with Christ. That greatness comes when we love one another, when we serve one another, when we are considerate, and when we give ourselves away. The way to greatness, Jesus says, is to become a servant, just as he was a servant. This is our call. Brothers and sisters, this is our mission. This is who we are. Amen.